Ubisoft have been pretty busy over the last 6 or so months with the release of Rainbow Six Siege in December, Far Cry Primal last month, and now finally Tom Clancy's The Division. An entirely new IP developed by Ubisoft Massive in something of a departure from the formula, in the sense that it's an entirely new franchise and not just another Assassin's Creed game. After a lengthy period in beta testing, it's now available for Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, and of course Microsoft Windows. Now, The Division gambles with a few mechanics and elements, and despite losing its footing here and there, it mostly succeeds at what it sets out to do, even if it does often suffer from Ubisoftitis, which I'll explain later on in the review. Before we get started, I should also say that this is a very large game with a lot to see and do, and we're going to be taking a look at the most important mechanics and how the game plays and feels. And if you're after someone who's going to do a 20-minute long Wikipedia-style video on the ins and outs of every single little mechanic, then you should probably just stop watching right now. Having said that, let's all get activated and take a look at the game then, shall we? So from the get-go, The Division does set up a captivating premise. The game is set in New York after a disease called the Green Poison causes absolute pandemonium, turning Manhattan into a quarantine zone. Your character is an agent for The Division, a bunch of highly trained soldiers lying in wait until the world apparently goes to hell, in which case they're called into action, which is exactly what happens, as your superior officer Fei Lau orders you to Manhattan to assist the JTF, or the Joint Task Force. Here you're up against three major factions, the Rikers, the Cleaners, and the LMB. After creating your character's appearance from a disappointingly basic set of options, and after playing through a short prologue sequence, you're dropped in Manhattan and the game world essentially opens up to you. From this point on, you're free to tackle story and side missions as you level up your character. Eventually, more and more plot-related missions are available, and the backstory behind the origin of the Green Poison is revealed. You're free to play solo or team up with 3 other players, which can be a blessing and a curse depending on how lucky you get. Now, I say this because whilst playing co-op is generally a lot more fun compared to playing with yourself, you might have to deal with low-level players joining missions they're undergeared for, or players with bad connections, or just idiots who can't play the game very well. Now, the real central mechanic of the game is the base of operations, which is your home base in a sense that is broken up between a medical, security, and technical wing. Each mission you complete earns you resources for each of the 3 wings, and then you're able to spend those resources on adding various new features to each wing, which in turn unlocks new skills and perks for your character. There's also other fast travel points around the map, but the base is the only place you can craft new gear, so you'll spend a bit of time here in between missions. Speaking of the missions, it's a bit of a shame that most of them are quite boring and repetitive. Most of the story missions just require you to run to a well-labelled waypoint, activate something or kill a bunch of bad guys, then move on to the next area and do it all again. Side missions are broken down into a few different types, mostly either hostage rescues, helping out the JTF, searching for the whereabouts of missing people, or just killing a bunch of bad guys.
Hostile HQ neutralized.
Each area of the city is defined by the level of the enemies you come up against, but the side missions themselves are always going to be the same. Some of the later story missions are admittedly very action-packed, but it all does feel very familiar. The enemy types are largely broken up depending on their attack method. There's guys who just run around and shoot at you, there's enemies who throw grenades, there's snipers, and there's guys with shotguns that rush your position. Later on, you'll see tougher armoured enemies that I guess serve as elites or champions, which will take one of those aforementioned groups, but just soak up a lot more damage. Surprisingly too, there's a little bit of depth to the shooting. I mean, on the surface it does look like a simple cover-based shooter, which it is, but the inclusion of a more traditional health bar system with limited medkits and various skills to choose from makes the combat a little bit more tactical. Whenever you're firing on an enemy in cover, you can actually keep them suppressed, allowing your teammates to flank them from the sides. And just because you're behind cover doesn't mean you're magically going to be invulnerable to incoming damage. And I really think people who just dismiss this game as a standard third-person shooter haven't spent enough time with it. Now, whilst the enemy AI isn't groundbreaking, it gets the job done. They're pretty good at taking cover and flanking, as well as lobbing grenades on your position and retreating if need be, though the real difficulty comes from the amount of health they have and the damage they can dish out. Initially, the game isn't too hard, in fact it's laughably easy, but later in the game, around level 15 or so, the enemies become absolute bullet sponges, and can survive an entire magazine to the face. By level 25 and upwards, your entire health bar is going to drop off in a matter of hits. Now from this point, your gear is going to play a big part in how well you do, and it's broken down into colours depending on its rarity, for guns and armour respectively, with statistics affecting your health, DPS and skills. But the stronger boss-like enemies in the heavy armour carrying miniguns or flamethrowers can often only be defeated by exploiting their AI and shooting them repeatedly in the head. The game almost requires the use of a marksman rifle, which greatly increases headshot damage, making these guys more tolerable. And buffing the effects of critical hits and headshot damage through weapon mods is almost essential late game. There is a fair bit of grinding to be done as well, whether it be to level up for the next story mission or just to get resources to upgrade your base of operations, and it can be very tedious doing the same 4 or 5 missions over and over. Now, this is the Ubisoft-itis that I mentioned earlier. It's that sense of a tremendous game world made up of simply repeating a few mundane tasks over and over. When you get bored with the missions, you can head into the Dark Zone, which is the game's PvP environment, though the game does discourage you from killing other players. Enemies in the Dark Zone are a lot tougher, but the rewards are also greater, and on top of that, players are free to kill other players if they wish, though this grants you a rogue status, allowing others to kill you without a penalty. Having said that, though, I didn't really come across too many people who tried to kill me, compared to the beta where every single shithead took a shot at me on sight. In fact, people will often try to stick together, forming unspoken alliances and helping each other out against the tougher enemies. You'll still get the odd dingbat who wants to attack everyone else like a moron, but most people aren't complete dickheads, and it's just far more beneficial to work together.
Rogue agent neutralized.
This is definitely the most unique element of the game. It reminds me of DayZ, except it's not an unoptimized, unfinished, buggy piece of shit. Sadly though, I had a lot of connection issues when I was playing both in the Dark Zone and the normal missions, which would make gunfights unfairly difficult as I had to deal with rubber banding when trying to shoot an enemy. I had one instance where I disconnected during a mission. I couldn't log back in for 15 minutes, but by the time I finally got back in, the mission had been finished and I'd still leveled up from it. If there is another massive takeaway for The Division, it's that it's a pretty damn good looking game. The level of detail is absolutely astonishing at times. When you're walking down a city street, there's wrecked cars, there's garbage bags piled up in the street, there's smashed windows and apartments all boarded up. And this consistency is held across the entire game world. You'll see citizens arguing over supplies, you'll see them searching through garbage, and you'll see stray dogs running around looking for food. The sound effects are fantastic too, though the voice acting and music isn't very prominent, but some of the weapon effects, particularly explosions and fire, look and sound great. I'm also quite fond of the UI, which is very simplistic but shows you everything you need to know, and a lot of the on-screen prompts are helpful without cluttering things up too much. On the flip side though, the frame rate is all over the place, with little change since the beta, even with the most recent Nvidia drivers. I tried installing it on my SSD as well, and still no change, but here's hoping they can fix this in the future. The Division isn't going to rock the gaming world, but there's still a lot of stuff here for people who are able to get invested in it. And it offers limitless customization options to craft the experience to your own personal preference. From the plethora of perks and skills to unlock, the countless weapons and modifications you can mess around with, right down to your character's appearance from the clothes you scavenge in the game world. The amount of content on offer here from the get-go is surprisingly thorough as well, and despite the obvious planned DLC, you're getting tremendous bang for the buck. After 20 odd hours in the game, I still have plenty of things left to get done, and I don't see myself stopping anytime soon. I was a little bit miffed by the connection issues, the subpar performance, and the repetition of missions. But when the pieces all came together and I was in an explosive gunfight with 3 other people, taking on waves of scumbags, I was having a hell of a good time. And to me, that's all that mattered.